The moment I heard guilty, guilty, and guilty, I was excited, I was happy, because African American people, we feel that we never get justice. We feel like it's just us all the time. Like I said once before, this is a fraternity that I didn't ask to be in. And unfortunately, you have a lot of families, they need counseling. They need somebody to get out and speak for them, because they may not be able to, because people be in a lot of pain.
Hello, everyone. I'm Tanya Rivero. Welcome back to CBSN. That was George Floyd's brother, Columnist, speaking to CBS This Morning co-host Gayle King about his reaction to the guilty verdict in Derek Chauvin's trial. Former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin has been found guilty on all 3 charges, marking an inflection point after nearly a year of racial justice protests that began with George Floyd's death. Despite a large police presence in most major cities, peaceful protests were held immediately after the guilty verdict was read and continued into the night. Meanwhile, the Department of Justice launched a probe into the Minneapolis Police Department. Attorney General Merrick Garland says it will look for any pattern or practice of using excessive force, including at protests. They will also be investigating whether or not the department engages in discriminatory behavior. Despite all the momentum leading up to and following the verdict, police in Columbus, Ohio, fatally shot 16-year-old Micaiah Bryant just moments before the verdict was read. Police have released the body cam video. Bryant's death is a stark reminder of how much work is left to be done. Joining me now for more is CBS News political analyst Jamelle Bouie. Jamelle is also an opinion columnist for the New York Times. Jamelle, welcome. Great to have you with us. So we heard mixed reactions yesterday after the trial, from relief to cautious optimism. Was this the justice that protesters and the Floyd family were seeking? And how do we move forward from here?
I think you could say this was the accountability that they were seeking, the accountability that was necessary in this case. But I'm not sure I would call it justice, just because justice would mean that George Floyd was alive, that he came back somehow, and that's simply not going to happen. Which means going forward, for as much as there needs to be more accountability for police killings, especially ones as terrible as this one, it's more important and more vital that we find ways to just fundamentally reshape policing, to create a world where these kinds of contacts are not happening on a regular basis, where police officers are not walking into situations not ready to serve the community, not ready to de-escalate a conflict, but essentially guns blazing. As the verdict was being read yesterday, there was a 15-year-old girl in Columbus, Ohio, I believe, who was killed. And that, to me, and who appears to have been killed sort of immediately at the beginning of a confrontation. And that, to me, is sort of indicative of the kind of, I think, rot in American policing that needs to be uprooted in order to get to the kind of place that the country needs to be, where communities can trust that law enforcement is actually there for their best interests.
It does seem like the movement to lethal force happens, far too quickly in so many of these police encounters, that we're hearing about. Jamelle, much of the country watched the video of George Floyd's death, but there still seemed to be anxiety gripping the country when the verdict was read. Walk us through some of the history of police officers on trial and how that impacted many of those waiting to hear the verdict.
The history of police officers on trial is pretty thin. It doesn't happen very often. And when it does, typically the police officers are acquitted. I think the most famous example in recent memory is that of the Rodney King trial, where the officers involved in that assault were acquitted. And this is very common. It is very difficult to hold a police officer legally accountable under the criminal justice system for police violence. That's because of Supreme Court rulings that give wide discretion to police officers in the use of lethal force. That is because police unions have been very effective in protecting their members and when shootings occur. And that, I think, is simply because a certain amount of cultural deference given to police officers by ordinary jurors, by the media even, about the necessity of the use of lethal force. And you put all of those things together, and it's just a rare occurrence for a police officer to be held criminally liable for the use of lethal force on the job. And so, to the extent that people were, waiting with bated breath to see what the ruling was going to be, it's entirely reasonable to think that they would be pretty pessimistic that you would get a guilty verdict. And I should say that this guilty verdict essentially happens because you have a confluence of every event going in the right way for the prosecution. You have a video, a widely seen video. You have other police officers testifying against the defendant. You have essentially a police department trying to present itself as not being a part of this kind of thing and kind of isolating the officer as an outlier, as a bad apple, so to speak. You don't have that most of the time. Most of the time you do have what is called that blue line.
Right. But, you mentioned the video. There are some of us who are old enough to remember the Rodney King video, and that seemed to be, to many people, as clear cut as this video, and that did not result in a guilty verdict.
I think what's the distinction to make between the Rodney King video in 1992 and the present is that in 92, a video assault of a person by law enforcement was very rare. It was so rare that it was possible to sort of write it off as, at least for many members of the public, you could write it off as being an outlier, essentially, just one bad case out of what is normal peaceful interactions. But we know in the past 5 years or 6 years at this point that of ubiquitous cell phone video of assaults by law enforcement, that we know that this isn't common. And the video itself, I think the specific video, was striking to a lot of people in its brutality, in its length, right? 9 minutes. And so I think this particular video the particular video of George Floyd's death comes in a context when it just carries much more weight, when the public understands that this is not uncommon. And then it was bad. It was a very heartbreaking and tragic thing to watch, and that matters as well.
Now, Jamelle, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi spoke out shortly after the verdict was read, and she did receive backlash for her comments. I want to play those comments first, and then we'll discuss.
Thank you, George Floyd, for sacrificing your life for justice, for being there to call out to your mom. How heartbreaking was that? Call out for your mom. I can't breathe. But because of you, and because of thousands, millions of people around the world who came out for justice, your name will always be synonymous with justice.
What's your take on Nancy Pelosi's words there? And do white politicians on either side of the political spectrum understand what is at stake for the Black community here? And are they capable of making the kind of change that many protesters are asking for?
That Speaker Pelosi's comment was obviously, I think, well-meaning, but it's frankly sort of perverse to thank George Floyd for his death. He wasn't a willing martyr. He wasn't really even a martyr. He was just a person trying to live his life, and he died. And it is perhaps, I wouldn't say beneficial. It is. You can make lemonade out of lemons here in the amount of awareness that came out of his death and the fact that we have this guilty verdict. But again, the optimal outcome here, what should have happened, is that George Floyd should have gotten out of the interaction alive. He should be here with us. To the extent that politicians, and I wouldn't even say white politicians here, I'm just going to say politicians here, because politicians generally, because I'm not sure that this is something, this challenge is particular to white politicians. To the extent that politicians are still working within a paradigm that leaves most of the assumptions of American policing unchallenged, then I'm not really sure how much they can do. A thing that I think does not get commented on enough is the fact that in these cities where we have had this kind of police violence, this isn't, these aren't conservatives, these aren't conservatives leading these cities. These are Democrats. These are often African-American Democrats. So it's not as if Black politicians have some inherent understanding here. They're all operating within a set of assumptions and systems and institutions. And if those are going to be left unsettled, unchallenged, then I'm not sure how much fundamental change we can expect. It's only in a situation, it's only when there's a willingness to really fundamentally rethink what policing is, which means challenging those assumptions and those institutions and those structures. It's only then that I think we can maybe see the kind of meaningful change that activists want from politicians.
Jamelle Bouie, thank you so much for joining us. As always, we appreciate your insight and perspective.
Thank you so much for having me.